Hello, and welcome to the latest of the Kavli Foundation's Spotlight Live webcasts, which offer a chance to hear from scientists on the cutting edge of discovery. Today, we're doing a gut check with Christopher Lowry, a scientist and neuroscientist at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Christopher studies stress and stress-related disorders, such as anxiety, depression, and PTSD. One of the themes of his research is trying to understand how microbes and the immune system influence our emotions and the way our brains respond to stress. My name is Lindsay Borthwick, and I cover neuroscience for the Kavli Foundation. I'll be moderating today's hangout. Unfortunately, Sarkis Mazmanian is unable to join us. Before we get started, let me remind you that if you have a question, please send it by email to info@kavlifoundation.org or via Twitter using the hashtag KavliLive. I'd also like to mention that I'll be moderating another Spotlight Live in the coming weeks. Keeping with the theme of microbes, I'll be speaking with a group of astrobiologists about how extremophiles, those are the microorganisms that live in the Earth's most extreme places, are spurring the search for extraterrestrial life. We'll be posting the details shortly, so please check the Kavli Foundation's website or follow us on Facebook or Twitter to learn more. So what is the microbiome? Simply put, it's the bacteria, viruses, fungi, and other microbes that live on and in the body. They're abundant, especially in the gut and intestine. In fact, these single-celled organisms outnumber our human cells by 10 to 1, and they're diverse. Have a look at the diagram of the microbiome's evolutionary tree, created by the scientists behind the Microbiome project. Those scientists conducted a census of the microbes that inhabit 5 parts of the human body. So we now have a good idea of which organisms call us home. So the key question for scientists has now become, just what are those microbes doing? And how are they doing it? Among other things, it turns out that our gut microbiome, or our gut microbes, are talking to the brain and even influencing our behavior. An idea that was highly controversial just a few years ago. But thanks to research like Christopher's and Sarkis's, it has rapidly gained traction. In the next 30 minutes, we'll talk about what we know about the gut microbiome-brain connection and where it may be leading us. Christopher, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here.
Great. So we'll get started. My first question is, do we know which particular species or community of microbes are most important for brain health?
Well, there's two sides to brain health, the good side and the bad side. And it seems that the bacteria that are involved in promoting brain health are different, as you might expect, from bacteria that have the potential to harm our health. So we don't have a really good understanding on which bacteria are important for promoting health, but there's a few themes that are emerging. Currently, most of the studies that are showing effects on behavior of gut microbes are studies involving bacteria from 2 phyla. Phyla is the biggest level of organization of bacteria, and those include actinobacteria and firmicutes. So let me explain a little bit about that. The most evidence is from the firmicutes, and predominantly these are lactobacilli. And these are bacteria that you'll often find in probiotics. And it's this type of bacterial species that empirically has proven to show behavioral benefits, so to speak. In other words, can inhibit anxiety-like behavioral responses in animal models, etc.
Okay.
Our own work focuses on a different type of bacteria altogether. These are called the actinobacteria, and we focus on one called Mycobacterium vaccae. It's a specific type of actinobacteria, and generally these types of bacteria are found in the soil, but humans are exposed to these bacteria through our environment, through either ingesting these types of bacteria in the water or in the plants that we eat.
Okay.
So that's the good side. The bad side, there's growing evidence that certainly certain types of proteobacteria can harm our mental health.
And what are proteobacteria?
So there's 2 major classes of bacteria. One is gram positive, one is gram negative, and the proteobacteria are gram negative largely, and they express something called lipopolysaccharide, or it's a molecule that's found on the surface of these gram negative bacteria that can promote inflammation.
Okay.
And it's probably through these pro-inflammatory effects that they're having harmful effects on mental health.
Okay. So we've talked about bacteria, but one of our viewers noted in an email that much of the research has focused on bacteria, possibly at the expense of viruses, yeast, and other microbes that are dwelling in our microbiome. Is it likely that they're just as important, and is this being studied?
Yes, the human virome, as it's called, is being studied. There's some older work showing effects of viruses on human behavior and animal behavior. But in terms of the gut virome and the emphasis on the gut-brain axis, that is less widely studied. And so I think we do need to catch up in that area. The fungi are also going to be important. Again, less work being done in terms of signaling from the gut to the brain. And another microorganism that we should pay attention to are the helminths, or the parasites.
Okay.
And although we don't, in modern urban societies, we don't often have these types of parasites in our gut, humans evolved with these types of parasites in our gut, and it may be the case that our immune systems are optimally adapted to having these parasites present.
Okay.
And they've only been missing for about 50 years. And there are efforts, in fact, including in neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, to try and reintroduce some of these helminths, some of these parasites, as a form of treatment. So that's an active area, including in clinical trials.
Right. So on the one hand, we have fecal transplants, and on the other hand, people are trying to reintroduce these helminths. Okay.
That's right.
Now, you just mentioned the one of the strains of bacteria that you work with, the soil bacterium. Now, you found that it can improve the way mice respond to stress. I mean, what prompted you to test this in the first place?
You know, our initial interest in this question was really focused on the question of how do the lungs talk to the brain.
Okay.
And it was a very fundamental question because very little work had been done on how the lungs can communicate to the brain. So we weren't really thinking in terms of clinical applications at that point. But then there was a study that was published in 2004 by Mary O'Brien and her colleagues, and they were looking at the effects of this Mycobacterium vaccae, as a potential treatment for cancer. In that particular trial, Mycobacterium vaccae did not have survival benefits, but in contrast, it improved quality of life measures. And this included things like increased emotional health, increased cognitive function, decreased pain. And we thought surely this is because somehow this bacterium is altering brain function. I should follow up by saying there's a press release 3 days ago now showing that a related Mycobacterium, Mycobacterium abuense, does have survival benefits in cancer, pancreatic cancer.
Okay. So how did the behavior of your mice change in response to that microbe?
Yeah, essentially the mice became what we would call more proactive in terms of dealing with stress. And essentially that just means doing something about your situation as opposed to just being passive and reactive. And these types of stress coping patterns have been documented in humans as well. It's a widely recognized dichotomy in behavioral responses to stressors, even among animals. And in humans, it's known that a more proactive response to a stressor is associated with less adverse health outcomes and more resistance to anxiety and depression-like phenotypes. And especially in the last few years, especially the work of Susan Wood, UNC, is showing that in animal models as well, these proactive coping mechanisms individuals that have these proactive coping mechanisms are less likely to develop anxiety and depressive-like phenotypes in response to stress. And so we perceive that as a good thing, that it shifts behavior toward more proactive behavior. And we're seeing that in other, although our initial tests were done in swimming model.
Okay.
We've now replicated this shift in other types of stressors. So it seems to be a general effect to shift toward this different strategy for dealing with stress, essentially.
Okay.
A more positive one.
I see. Huh. Now, do you have any ideas about how the microbe, which is ingested by the mice, correct? How it's communicating with the brain?
I should clarify. And in our initial studies, because we were focused on the lungs, we were putting the bacteria into the lungs.
Okay.
And we put the bacteria in the lungs in a way that it would be retained within the lungs. And so we're looking at how does a lung through nerve fibers convey information to the brain.
I see.
And so that's what we were doing in those studies. We're now interested in looking at effects when we introduce it into the gut. So what was your question again?
Well, I was wondering how a microbe that lives in the gut basically talks to the brain. What are the current ideas on that?
So I'm gonna open it up to a broader discussion outside of our own work, because there's a lot of other work that helps answer this question. And the answer to that question is actually really complicated in the sense that there are many ways, not just one way.
Okay.
And I can give several examples of the many ways that bacteria in the gut are communicating with the brain. And the first and the simplest, maybe not the simplest, but perhaps the easiest to grasp, is the fact that bacteria are producing small molecules that can get into the body, get into the bloodstream, and affect brain function. And there's very clear examples of this in a rodent model of autism, where in a maternal immune activation model, where there's inflammation during the fetal period of development, where there's a particular metabolite that's being produced that is massively upregulated after this inflammatory insult. And probiotics are able to reverse that increase in metabolite.
I see.
And so the metabolites, the things that the bacteria are making and releasing, are affecting our physiology and behavior. Another way is that our immune system has adapted ways of sampling what types of bacteria are in our gut. And one of the ways that our body does this is through specialized cells called M cells, or microfold cells. And they can literally take up these tiny bacteria into the cell and then present it on the other side, inside the body, to our immune system. And this can affect our adaptive immunity. It can affect our T cell function and function of dendritic cells. And this affects not only the immune function in the gut, in the mucosal lining of the gut, but also systemically it's affecting our immune system. And our immune system, from a systemic perspective, can affect the brain function. So the gut is interacting with our own body, and our own body is sampling this microbiota to find out what's there.
I see.
Depending on what's there, our body is sending different signals to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So the mucosal lining can either detect something that's perceived as threatening or something that's perceived as safe, and then it can respond in an appropriate way. So that's the second way. A third way is inflammation. Some bacteria are pro-inflammatory. They increase inflammation. They can actually damage the mucosal lining of the gut and induce something called colitis. And this colitis can increase the rate at which bacteria are moving from the gut into the body. And we can actually see this. We see numbers of these types of bacteria increasing in the body after this breakdown in the mucosal barrier. So gut microbes can get into the body if the mucosal lining is compromised. There's also evidence, we don't know the exact mechanisms, that probiotics can affect the blood-brain barrier. So that's the barrier that protects the brain from the body. And then a final mechanism, which is really fascinating, is that there are multiple sensory nerves that go from our gut to the brain. One of those is called the vagus nerve. There are also sensory nerves that go through the sympathetic nerve fibers, and these are sometimes called sympathetic afferents. They go to the spinal cord. So you can imagine almost like two different freeways going up to the brain and carrying electrical signals. So the microbes, by affecting these sensory fibers, can directly affect neuronal electrical activity in the brain. And what's exciting about that is it's almost a laser-like precision with which these nerve fibers are altering brain function.
Really?
And so you can imagine that by activating certain types of nerve fibers, you would be able to affect certain types of brain processes. And a particularly exciting pathway is the spinal parabrachial pathway, which seems to be connected to our affective circuits in the brain, cortical circuits that are involved in controlling our mood.
Our mood, really. So there's that close a connection with the gut in that case.
There's increasing interest in somehow being able to selectively activate these different populations of sensory fibers. And NIH has announced the National Institutes of Health, which funds a vast majority of research in the United States, is requesting information on a new program called SPARK. And essentially, this is designed for development of electroceuticals, is what these are being called, where they're devices that can somehow electronically, selectively activate these sensory fibers, specific sensory fibers. But we can also do that with probiotics and other health-promoting microorganisms if we can figure out how individual bacteria are communicating with these sensory fibers. That's what's really exciting.
Okay. Wow, there's a lot going on. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about human trials. I mean, you talked about the fact that you can pretty dramatically modify a mouse's behavior with a single type of microbe. Has anybody taken this to humans?
They have in a couple of instances. There's a group that has used probiotic formulation and shown that giving this probiotic formulation for several weeks to women is altering the activity of brain areas that are involved in mood and cognitive function. And so this is directly showing that simply by taking probiotics, the activity of the brain is altered in the brain, specifically the brain areas that are controlling cognitive and affective function. There is one other study, a clinical trial, where they looked at the effects of a probiotic and measured emotional health outcomes, essentially, and saw improvements. And so there's a few studies that are just trickling out at the moment where people are trying these approaches in humans and looking for positive health outcomes. Of course, all these studies at the moment have been done on healthy populations, but we suspect that in the future we're going to see more and more trials in clinical populations like depressed patients, patients with PTSD, and possibly even neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and schizophrenia. That's what we would predict.
Yeah, this is sort of the bugs as drugs approach, right? Where you give a probiotic, which is a beneficial bacteria. I mean, how far do you think we really are from the day when that might become a reality, that we might be able to use bugs as drugs to treat brain disorders?
Well, I think if we knew which commercially available probiotics might have health benefits, we could start tomorrow. But in terms of, going through the normal regulatory procedures with the FDA and getting approval for specific probiotics for mental health conditions. I think we're quite a long way off. I think those trials are being initiated now. We're certainly trying to move forward with that in PTSD populations, veterans of foreign wars, and those efforts are just getting started. But I'm sure there are other groups that are moving in the same direction.
Okay. We were down to 10 minutes left in the webcast, so I'm going to ask some more viewer questions. So let me just skip ahead here. Well, we talked a bit about how gut microbes influence the way the brain works, and that translates into behavior. But what about brain development? One of our viewers wanted to know, can the microbiome actually affect the way that we're wired?
At least based on animal studies, this seems to be quite certain, and that's due to recent work showing that, I mentioned it earlier, that this maternal immune activation model that's been used, it's a model of autism. It results in social deficits in mice in this case. And what they found is that these social deficits can be reversed by giving a probiotic at specific developmental times. And this is very promising. It goes along with the idea that some neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and schizophrenia have risk associated with increases in inflammation. And the same is true for some psychiatric disorders, particularly stress-related psychiatric disorders like PTSD and depression. And if, in fact, inflammation is a significant risk factor, this is something that we can do something about. Mm-hmm. And certain probiotics are proving to be very effective at limiting the amounts of inflammation. So in other words, if inflammation is a risk factor, and you can use probiotics to suppress the inflammation, then you're effectively removing that risk factor. And this would apply to both inflammation during development in neurodevelopmental disorders, and also inflammation that seems to be a risk factor for diseases with adult onset like PTSD and major depression.
Okay. We have a question also about C. diff. That's a nasty infection often acquired in the hospital. So our viewer is wondering about the connection between C. diff, gut microbes, antibiotics in the brain. And could months of antibiotic treatment for C. diff, for example, lead to depression and anxiety? Is there any evidence of that?
So let me take a step back. And as you mentioned, antibiotics are one of the major risk factors for C. diff. And the reason for that is because we know from both these epidemiological studies in humans and also studies in animals that when the diversity of the gut microbiota declines, and that can be either due to stress or to antibiotics, that creates an opportunity for pathogenic microbes to bloom and expand. Right. And some of these microbes, like C. diff, can induce these inflammatory processes that we've been talking about. And certainly from that perspective, because C. diff is able to induce this local inflammation in the gut, it certainly has the potential, based on what we know from other models, to increase vulnerability to stress-related psychiatric disorders.
Okay. Another question is, in the roundtable discussion that we have on the Kavli Foundation website, we talked a little bit about whether you've changed your lifestyle or your diet because of the research that you're doing into the gut microbiome and its connection to the brain. Can you elaborate on some of the changes that you've made?
Yeah, I'm much more wary to take antibiotics unnecessarily. Antibiotic use is a potential risk, certainly a risk factor in terms of reducing the diversity of our gut microbiota. I've also started taking probiotics,
Hmm.
specifically probiotics that I think have potential for anti-inflammatory effects.
Okay.
Um, and and I also eat more plants, more fresh vegetables. And the rationale for this and trying to get my kids to eat more vegetables is because it turns out from the American Gut Project, which is being co-run by Rob Knight here at CU Boulder, the major factor that determines the diversity of the gut microbiota is the number of different plants that you eat.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the diversity of our gut microbiota, which is promoting our health, is coming from plants. And I didn't realize this until perhaps a month ago, but plants themselves contain an enormous diversity of bacteria. And these are, I didn't know these existed, but they're called endophytes. These bacteria live inside the plant. So when you wash the plant, you can't get rid of them. They're inside the cells, inside the plant. And one particularly striking example to me is a 3 to 4 leaf spinach plant. We've all eaten spinach, right? Tiny spinach plant contains over 800 different species of bacteria. And when we eat spinach, we eat those 800 different species of bacteria. And that contributes to our diversity. A lot of those are the actinobacteria, the bacteria that are found in the environment, in the soil, but many other types of bacteria as well.
Huh. So an apple a day really could keep the doctor away.
Literally, for reasons that we never suspected, right? I
Right.
mean, when we talk about eating fresh vegetables and the health benefits of fresh vegetables, we're typically thinking of the minerals and the vitamins,
Mm-hmm.
undigestible fiber, that type of thing. But at least to me, this opens up a whole new area of inquiry is what is the effect of these environmental bacteria that are coming from plants? And the microbiome of these plants is different depending on where the plant is grown, as you might suspect. And so if you're eating, I only mention this because if you're eating locally grown plants, plants that are grown in your own backyard or your own community, that might have different effects on your immune system compared to eating plants from a different country, which is often how we get our fresh.
Say that's the same effect with honey and allergy. Eat the honey that's grown locally.
Exactly. I don't know that that's the will create the best outcome, but it does raise the question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What is the effect of eating a global produce
Right.
that's not from local sources?
I mean, the New York Times raised the question recently, is there a normal microbiome? I mean, what kind of research is being done to figure out, what indeed is an optimal microbiome?
Yeah, there's several efforts to characterize the human gut microbiome. I know some of your readers are interested in the opportunity or possibility to find out about their own gut microbiome. And they can do that by going online and looking at the American Gut Project. And just type that into Google and you'll find it. It's a nonprofit exercise to characterize the gut microbiome of Americans. International viewers are also welcome to participate. I think the cost is slightly higher. But basically, you can have your gut microbiome determined, and that information will be sent to you, and you can compare yourself to other people in the U.S. and around the world. And so we're learning more and more about what's there. Now it's a matter of determining what's normal, why is it normal, and what types of changes in the gut microbiota can lead to adverse health outcomes. What we know already from studies by Jesse Metcalf and other people that have looked at ancient microbiota. These are microbiota from 8,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago. What we know is the ancient microbiota resembles more the microbiota that you would find in traditional rural cultures in our modern era. In other words, people that are living in rural conditions without extensive modern hygiene, and in fact are very different from the microbiota of the cosmopolitan American, urban dwelling American. So over the last certainly 1,000 years, probably even less, a shorter period of time, our gut microbiota has changed dramatically. It could be due to diet, or it could be due to antibiotics, hygiene practices. Many different factors are involved, but it's certainly different. That might create an evolutionary mismatch. In other words,
Right.
our gut microbiota is different from how it evolved throughout evolution.
Okay. So in terms of prioritizing or finding ways to improve your gut health, diet seems to be one of the main things that we really do have control of, and that's going to have a major influence then.
Yeah, I know from watching Rob Knight's talks that there are certainly three factors that are of major importance. One is the number of different plants you eat. Another is exercise. So chronic or regular exercise alters the gut microbiota, and antibiotics obviously are altering the gut microbiota, and the amount of sleep that you get. So people that get less than 6 hours of sleep a night, that has an effect on the diversity of your gut microbiota. So there are certain things we can do things about that can impact our gut microbiota.
Oh, that's good news. Well, we've actually reached our 30-minute mark. I mean, this has been a truly fascinating discussion. I'm sure our viewers will agree. And I know I'll be paying more attention to my gut health. So thank you very much, Christopher. And I just wanted to end by saying, for those who are interested, we'll be posting a transcript of this discussion on the Kavli Foundation website shortly. And that's kavlifoundation.org. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Lindsay.
All right.